It is the 28th of October, in the year 312. On the outskirts of Rome, two armies are staring each other down across a narrow river crossing called the Milvian Bridge, and neither man leading them has any idea that by sundown, the entire trajectory of Western civilization will have quietly, violently, permanently changed. One of these men will be alive by nightfall. The other will be at the bottom of the Tiber, weighed down by his own armor and, arguably, by his own ego. To understand how the Roman Empire ended up here, we need to rewind a few years, because Rome in the early 4th century was not exactly a model of stable government. The Emperor Diocletian had tried something clever: split the empire into 4 pieces, each run by a co-emperor, so no single person got too powerful. It was called the Tetrarchy, and on paper, it looked like a tidy system of checks and balances. In practice, it was 4 ambitious men in a very expensive game of musical chairs, and when the music stopped, everybody wanted the same seat. By 312, that seat belonged, at least in the western half of the empire, to a man named Maxentius, who was holed up in Rome, behaving like the eternal city was his personal inheritance, rather than a job with a great deal of competition. Maxentius had reason to feel confident. He controlled Rome itself, he had the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard, and he had more troops than the man marching toward him. That man was Constantine, governor of the western provinces, commander of a smaller but battle-hardened army, and someone history would eventually nickname the Great, though at this particular moment he was simply a general with a serious problem. An army twice the size of his own standing between him and the capital of the known world. Constantine did not march on Rome because he woke up one morning craving real estate. This was personal. Maxentius had been portraying himself as Rome's rightful defender against outside threats, conveniently ignoring that most of the threat was coming from his own catastrophic mismanagement. Grain shortages, political purges, a general sense that Rome was being run less like an empire and more like a increasingly unstable family business. Constantine, watching all this from Gaul, decided that if nobody else was going to deal with Maxentius, he would volunteer for the job, army in tow. The march south was swift and, frankly, a little terrifying for the cities in its path, because Constantine kept winning. Turin, Verona, one engagement after another, until the man who was supposed to be the underdog in this fight had built a reputation as someone you did not want to see approaching your city walls. By the time he reached the outskirts of Rome, Constantine had momentum, morale, and, if the later accounts are to be believed, something else entirely: a vision. According to the story that would echo through the centuries, Constantine looked up at the sky before the battle and saw a symbol of light, later interpreted as the Chi Rho, the first 2 letters of Christ's name in Greek, accompanied by the words, "In this sign, conquer." Whether this was a genuine mystical experience, a very convenient political narrative constructed after the fact, or a man having an extremely stressful pre-battle hallucination is something historians still argue about. And honestly, we're not going to settle it here. What we do know is that Constantine had his soldiers paint that symbol on their shields, which is either one of history's great acts of faith or one of history's great examples of a general realizing that a unifying brand identity boosts troop morale. Meanwhile, back in Rome, Maxentius was consulting the Sibylline books, Rome's ancient oracle of prophecy, and received an answer that has since become a masterclass in how not to interpret good news. The prophecy declared that on this day, an enemy of the Romans would perish. Maxentius, apparently without a flicker of self-doubt, decided this obviously meant Constantine. It did not occur to him even for a moment that he himself might qualify as the enemy in question. It is, to put it mildly, a decision that has aged about as well as milk left out in the Roman sun. Confident in his prophecy and in his numbers, Maxentius made a choice that military historians have been quietly shaking their heads at for over 1,700 years. Rome's walls were, at the time, some of the most formidable defenses in the ancient world. Constantine's army, for all its momentum, would have faced a brutal, possibly unwinnable siege trying to break through them. All Maxentius had to do was stay behind those walls and wait. Instead, buoyed by prophecy, ego, and the crowd's expectation that their emperor should fight rather than hide, Maxentius marched his army out to meet Constantine in open battle at the Milvian Bridge, and in doing so, threw away Rome's single greatest advantage. It is the ancient equivalent of holding a royal flush and folding anyway because a fortune cookie told you to go all in on a bluff. The bridge itself was the critical detail. The original stone Milvian Bridge could not safely support the full weight of Maxentius's army crossing at once, so his engineers had rigged an additional pontoon bridge alongside it. A temporary structure made of boats lashed together, reportedly designed with a clever mechanism allowing sections to be collapsed on command in case a fast retreat was needed. It was, in theory, a smart contingency plan. In practice, it became the single most efficient self-destruct button in ancient military history. When Constantine's forces struck, hitting Maxentius's line with the kind of disciplined ferocity that had carried them through every battle from Gaul to the gates of Rome, the outcome was decided quickly. Maxentius's army broke. Thousands of soldiers and Maxentius himself surged back toward the river, desperate to retreat across the bridges to the safety of the city walls they never should have left. And that is when the pontoon bridge, the clever emergency escape route, gave way under the crushing weight of a panicked, retreating army. Men and horses spilled into the Tiber by the hundreds. Maxentius, weighed down by heavy armor, went into the water with them and did not come back up. The emperor, who had been so certain the prophecy was about someone else, became, quite literally, its punchline. Constantine entered Rome the next day, not as an invader, but as a liberator, at least as far as the surviving population and the Senate were concerned. Maxentius's body was fished out of the river, and his head was paraded through the streets on a spear, before eventually being sent off on a tour of North Africa. A fairly unambiguous way of letting Maxentius's former allies know that the balance of power had shifted permanently. What makes the Battle of the Milvian Bridge more than just another chapter in Rome's long list of civil wars is what Constantine did next. Believing, or at least strategically claiming, that his victory had come under the protection of the Christian God, Constantine did not persecute Christianity the way many of his predecessors had. He tolerated it. He funded it. Within a year, he and his Eastern co-emperor issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious tolerance throughout the empire and effectively ending centuries of Christian persecution overnight. A faith that had spent generations being driven underground, fed to lions, and blamed for every fire, plague, and bad harvest the empire suffered, suddenly had the most powerful man in the Western world as its patron. From that single afternoon at a collapsing pontoon bridge, the dominoes just kept falling. Christianity's rise to becoming the dominant religion of Europe, the eventual founding of Constantinople, the entire trajectory of medieval Christendom, the theological and political architecture that would shape kingdoms, crusades, art, law, and war for the next 15 centuries, all of it traces back through this one battle. Historians still debate how much of Constantine's conversion was genuine spiritual conviction and how much was a savvy read of which way the cultural wind was blowing. And the honest answer is probably a bit of both. Constantine was, after all, a man who understood the value of a good origin story. So when we talk about battles that rewrote history, most conjure images of vast armies clashing across open plains, of decisive charges and thundering cavalry. But the Battle of the Milvian Bridge earns its place for a stranger, more human reason. An empire's future was decided not simply by the strength of two armies, but by one emperor's fatal overconfidence in a prophecy he never bothered to question, and one collapsing bridge that turned a retreat into a drowning. Sometimes history doesn't hinge on who has the bigger army. Sometimes it hinges on who reads the fine print. And on that October morning outside Rome, only one of these two men had done his homework.